All right. Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I know some of you from classes and from seeing you around. I'm the interim director of the Center for Data Science, and I'd like to thank you for coming. Well, thank you first for having been here in the first place and pioneering data science studies. We work very hard to develop the curriculum in the master's, in the PhD, and this would be impossible with you guys, and it's really been a pleasure educating you and you educating us also in the needs that students have nowadays for data science. We are really committed to building an alumni network and to remaining connected to you guys, because we think there's a lot of value for us, for our current students, but also for you. So we really look forward to working together with you. And I also want to thank our wonderful administrative team for setting this up, because I really think it's really important. It's very important that we grow as a community with you guys, the current students, the faculty, and we look forward to doing it. Thank you very much.
Cool. I'm just going to move that. I'll just step around the. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you for being here today. Hi, my name is Umang Bhatt. I am a faculty fellow that just started here at CDS. I'm also affiliated with a couple other places. I would love to tell you a little bit about the work that we're doing here. I'll try to keep it as brief as possible, but also hopefully it's informative for you guys to get a sense of the style of work we're doing. So with that being said, I've kept this actually quite high level. This is a version of a talk that I'd given at the House of Lords earlier this summer. So it's at a level that's hopefully super accessible, but sufficiently interesting. So predominantly a lot of our work covers what we call algorithmic transparency. And I like to start by zooming out and thinking a little bit more clearly about the types of systems we're building and the ways in which we're deploying them. Many times when we're studying data science and machine learning, we might start by thinking about a machine learning model that we have access to. And that machine learning model is going to interact with lots of different stakeholders in the real world, and there's going to be this constant interplay back and forth between these two individuals. For all intents and purposes of my research, we call this a human-machine team, trying to facilitate human-machine collaboration in a way that is sensible and other people can understand how human and machine ought to work together. Predominantly, a lot of my PhD research kind of covered this top arrow, really thinking more clearly about what can we communicate to stakeholders about what we know about machine learning models in a way that's useful for them. So we like to refer to this as transparency. There's lots of principles at organizations and even technical methods that are developed for providing explanations for machine learning systems. The way I like to define transparency for our research is any type of relevant information that you can have about a machine learning model. Now, this is super vague, and it's vague on purpose, because this permits us to get access to lots of different types of transparency and lots of different mechanisms and pieces of information we can provide people with. So I'll break this down a little more. We like to consider two different types of transparency. I think by that definition that I've just provided, a prediction technically is a piece of relevant information about how a model works. But there are two large categories that we think about. The first is procedural transparency, which I like to think about as the socio-technical ecosystem where a model lives. Right? Does anybody have a sense of things that might have to do with the model, but aren't necessarily some function of the model? Any thoughts on what would be considered socio-technical? Just out of curiosity. No wrong answers. Yeah, please. Type of inputs. Okay, that's a great one. What could be fed into a system? Any others? It's a piece of relevant information about how the system works. It's very vague, but it's not necessarily some function of the model itself. Yeah? The data it's been trained on. That's a good one. But by the definition that it being part of the socio-technical ecosystem, this actually the model depends on that information. Any other thoughts? Interesting. Yeah, definitely. These kinds of like socio-technical pieces of information kind of cover a couple things. So one of them could actually just be disclosure, the fact that maybe you only have access to 50 queries for the day, right? You see this all the time when you start to interact with the system. You sign like some version of terms and conditions. There's a ton of research that goes into this, but drawing the guardrails of the research that we actually do. So I'm telling you kind of what's not in the line of work that we do. So disclosure, documentation, which kind of would cover the data that the system's trained on, what inputs can be fed into the system. I mean, in some sense, inference doesn't depend on this, right? But it's a way of documenting and providing a socio-technical infrastructure around the models such that we can communicate to people how these things work. Certification is something I'm super excited about. It's kind of like an Underwriter Labs equivalent of stamping that the system performs with this type of precision, and this is the kind of set of metrics that are permissible for this system. And technically code, by definition, is a socio-technical piece of information that you can provide to people. Now, that might not be transparency for most people, but again, it does count by the definition I've provided here. And on the other hand, we have this side of algorithmic transparency, which would be the other end of the spectrum. So prediction, perhaps even explainability, uncertainty, these are things that we necessarily work on. So what types of systems can you explain to me why your prediction, you said that this is a dog, not a cat? Can you explain to me how confident you are that this, in your dog classification, as it were, right? So these are pieces of information that are some function of the system itself, some function of the prediction itself. So predominantly a lot of our work, we study algorithmic transparency, not the former. There's a lot of really good, smart, fun people that we know that study procedural transparency. And a lot of our work to date has been on what I like to call explainability. So if we wanted to define that more precisely, we might call that some sort of insight into how the model behaves on particular data points. So we'd run this study a couple of years ago with an organization called the Partnership on AI, which is a global nonprofit that brings together civil societies, academia, governments, and corporations to kind of think about how can we build AI to benefit the people in society. It's a lofty mission, but precisely what I'd study with them is how are people actually using some of the explainability and interpretability tools that are popular. And if we wanted to study this, we run like these semi-structured interviews with a bunch of organizations. Think about like the execs of major tech companies, heads of civil societies, heads of folks in government. And I'll just share the findings with you. And if you're interested, I'm happy to talk about it. You guys can shoot me an email. Explainability is predominantly used for debugging, which is this really weird internal finding that like the notion of an explanation feels really good, but in some sense, the tools that we've built to date aren't really they don't let end users interact with the model in a new and sensible way. In some sense, our pursuit of explanation hasn't necessarily seen the light of day. A couple other things, the definitions and goals of explainability within organizations aren't necessarily clearly defined. So I know that many of you may work in industry and you might find that there are calls for transparency and calls for explainability, especially as we start to use larger systems, and especially as we've seen in the last few weeks and months, and people talking about generative AI or the abhorrent Gen AI term that people try to use. It just doesn't make sense. But in some sense, we don't have a clear sense of what do we want to explain to whom and why. And then there are obviously a bunch of technical limitations. So as I was saying, I'm keeping this really high level. There's lots of actually good, interesting content that we can discuss here. But I kind of want to zoom out for a second and think about this idea of taking the model to the stakeholder and providing them with explainability along the way. One of the things we can find is that you can quickly manipulate the explanation to tell you what you want to hear, such that you start to use these predictions in your decision-making tasks. Specifically, I can manipulate it and I can induce what we call over-reliance. Right? I can kind of convince you. Anybody know about the Xerox experiment that happened in the psych department, I think at Stanford in the 80s? It's a very fun experiment. They lined up a bunch of people standing in line to make a copy, and then someone gets in the back of the line, and you just basically tap the person in front of you and say, I'd like to make a copy, can I cut you? And that explanation is sufficient to get to the front of the line, right? And it's like this simple manipulation that is like ridiculous, right? Like, I mean, oh my gosh, obviously all of us are waiting for a copy. And it kind of convinces us that we have to be very careful when we're trying to craft and provide people with these forms of transparency. So I think I might just close with this interesting fact that when you're thinking about providing these systems to people, you might induce different types of reliance in individuals. On one end of the spectrum, the person you're providing the prediction with might kind of loaf. This is a term in organizational behavior, which is that I will just adhere to everything you tell me. Right? I'm not going to listen to my own opinion. I'm just going to do exactly what you tell me. You kind of have this theoretical other end of the spectrum, which we call opposition. This is like your old Luddites back in the day would have just like not listened to the system and kind of literally done the opposite or adhered at all, right? And I think that there's a lot of interesting work on what is known as algorithmic appreciation, where you tend to use the system more often than you ought to, right? And then you have this idea of algorithmic aversion, which is that you tend to use the system less often than is good for you. So in our work, we've kind of thought of appreciation as a form of overtrust, aversion as a form of distrust, but you need a really healthy middle ground, right? And we've come up with a term called algorithmic vigilance. It's when I'm being sensible, using common sense, and thinking about when is it good for me to use this system. But the one thing I would like to leave you guys with is that we have a lot of people that are worried about people over-appreciating, right? Kind of like taught that all the time. Oh my gosh, everybody's going to start using ChatGPT and it's going to become so bad, right? That's not actually that big of a problem. Right? We can fix that. That's a technical problem. This is a problem because we know that people are not very great at doing tasks by themselves, right? We know that we have lots of mistakes that we come across, and we know that these systems can be quite precise. So what mechanisms do we have in place to combat aversion? None. Right? How can we start to kind of build affordances and build systems where people don't avert? It's rather worrisome that aversion is becoming more common than appreciation. So I'd leave you guys with that in your work. It's like my one takeaway is that algorithmic transparency is good, but it's worrisome if it can lead to aversion. The second takeaway, I'll just kind of jump through. Do I have time or no? Yeah? Okay, I'll just keep going. Should I keep going? Okay, cool, I'll keep going. So that yeah, sure, got it, I got it. So on the back end, I guess, to complete a human-machine team, you need to come backwards, right? You need to go back from the stakeholder to the model. But the issue is that what lives on this arrow is so nebulous, right? Values, expectations, preferences. Like, come on, like, we studied math, a lot of us, right? I mean, this is hard. This makes no sense, right? But how can we do a better job about being clear about how a stakeholder, what type of information a stakeholder would want to provide into a system and how we incorporate it? So uncertainty is actually a really interesting mechanism for actually doing this, right? A stakeholder might be uncertain about making decisions, and one of the things that we've started to champion is this idea of appropriate access. So that means that if you have two different individuals, Alice and Bob, you might provide Alice with access to ChatGPT all the time, but you might only provide it to Bob 50% of the time. And this might be for various reasons. This might be that Bob's is a Fields Medal, and he doesn't necessarily need ChatGPT to do elementary level proofs, but Alice is a 5th grader. She'd love to do proofs using ChatGPT, right? So there's an interesting balance of if we start thinking more clearly about when we're actually providing people with these systems. And there's various reasons and things reasons you do this. One, it's cost saving, right? Like, you don't need to give it to Bob all the time. There's, again, the expertise, as I mentioned, or maybe there's some policies that are in place. You can't trade certain stocks if you haven't taken certain exams, right? You can't, it's basically the same thing. We have these affordances we've built for making sure that the right people are using these right forms of decision support at the right time. So my second takeaway to you would be that the appropriate use of AI systems can actually be learned. So we have a bunch of work actually learning these policies from Alice and Bob on the fly, which if you're excited about, it's actually quite fun. So, in sum, I think thinking about this idea of a human-machine team is at like the core of data science. On the top, I've talked to you a little bit about the types of work we've done on transparency. On the bottom, there's a lot of preference solicitation and access work that we're basically thinking about how to get access to these forms of machine learning. I love to work with lots of collaborators in lots of different fields, which I think is really important, both across law, design, philosophy, and obviously CS. And I'll take any questions if I have time. Thank you. Yeah. I guess we have time for one question or 0 questions? I don't know. Or none. A single question, sure, if you have any. No worries if not. Sure. Yeah, whoever. Yeah. So a lot of what shows up there is that you can exploit that, right? Because if I know what you want to hear, I just tell you what you want to hear. So there's this like a line of work that people call like ethics washing, right? Where it's like, okay, I know what you want to hear, so I'll just tell you what you want to hear. Like we've done a bunch of work where we tried to like, if I knew that you were going to use explanations downstream to determine the fairness of a model, I can start building explanation methods and building attacks, like adversarial style attacks, that'll basically make it look like my model is fair just from the explanation, right? So you've like ethics wash your explanation, be like, oh, of course it's not unfair. Like, look, the sensitive attribute is not used at all. We're not using race at all to make these decisions. It's pretty easy to do, right? And that's scary, but it's also something to be aware of, right? As someone who's a data scientist, like you know that these confirmation biases exist and you can exploit them. Obviously you shouldn't, but you should know that it's obviously very possible. Yeah, cool. Do you have a question? Yeah, go for it. Yeah. Sure. Yeah. Yeah, sure. Yeah, basically putting up safety guardrails. And I think that's why that last point around access is important. So thinking about access as a problem that can be learned, right? Where I'm thinking about when do you have access to this system? Like, are you asking, like the reinforcement learning with human feedback work that OpenAI has been championing for, by the way, 8 years. Like, it's not new at all. This line of work is basically trying to put up these guardrails. I'll leave you guys with one anecdote, which just gives you a sense of how nefarious some of these things can be. One thing that I had dinner years ago with this professor of poetry, and 2 years ago, and she is in a bunch of jihadist group chats for the Taliban. She studies poetry and particularly how music is used by terrorist organizations to rally the troops. And they are worried about the infinite generation of content that will basically be propaganda. Because I can get an infinite number of poems. One might work. But if I can get an infinite number of them, there is a serious problem. So how do we start to think about even putting up guardrails, maybe via regulation, which is why a lot of our work is with regulators, to think about, okay, maybe we should ban the usage of these systems in certain areas or for certain types of uses. So it's a tough question. I don't have a good answer, but that kind of story keeps me up at night because I'm like, I actually don't have a solution to this, but I know it's a problem. So thank you so much for your time today. Cheers.
All right, morning everyone. So I'm going to totally shift the topic of conversation here for a couple minutes. We're going to talk about redistricting, gerrymandering, some social science stuff, and how that intersects with data science. So quick review, what do I mean when I say redistricting? So every 10 years, we take the census, we get new population numbers for every part of the country, and on the basis of those numbers, we're going to redraw city council districts, state house districts, congressional districts, with the goal of making sure that each have equal populations, right? So as populations change, we've got to rebalance the districts. And that should be a very boring, very bureaucratic process, but in fact, it's totally the opposite of that, because how you draw the lines can end up having a really big impact on who gets elected. And so that's, once people realize that, right, that becomes then a very important site of political contestation. So that manifests most often in the form of gerrymandering. And I'm sure people have seen some graphic like this, but the idea is, like, let's say you have like a little mini state like this with an equal number of Democratic voters in blue and Republican voters in red. If you draw the lines one way, you end up with 3 majority Democratic districts and 1 Republican district. But if we draw the lines a different way, exact same population, suddenly we reverse that balance and the Republicans have the majority. And so if you're a party, you're obviously going to pick the set of lines, or you'd like to enact the set of lines that favors you. Okay, so when I put two things side by side like that, it's easy to see the impact that lines can have, but it's actually much tougher to look at any individual redistricting plan and say, oh, is this gerrymandered or not? Is this plan fair or not? And to give a great example of that, so I just moved down from Massachusetts a couple months ago, and in Massachusetts there's 9 congressional districts, and they're all represented by Democrats, okay? But 1 in 3 voters in Massachusetts is a Republican. Okay, so there are a third of the votes, but 0% of the seats. Show of hands, is that gerrymandered? Okay, we got a couple, some people shaking their head, okay? Well, it turns out no matter how I draw the lines, it's actually impossible for there to be a Republican majority district in Massachusetts. The like 30% Republican voters are just spread so evenly over the state. There's no area where they're a majority that's the size of a congressional district, okay? So that's an example of you can take the most extreme outcome. You could not get a more favorable Democratic outcome in terms of seats, and that still wouldn't be enough to definitively prove that something is or is not gerrymandered to favor that party. But identifying when things are gerrymandered is actually a big problem, right? Like as voters, we want to know if the maps are fair, and then like if these things end up in court, the court has to sift out should these lines be allowed or should they not. So how do we actually go about determining that? So the big idea that's sort of taken this world over in the last 10, 15 years is what we call like an ensemble analysis. And what I mean by that is you're going to come up with a big collection of random redistricting plans. The lines are drawn randomly, and they're drawn without, in particular, any partisan data. So that they're like a non-partisan baseline. And specifically what I mean by that is like we're going to define some probability distribution over all the possible plans, and we're just going to, and that distribution is going to be nonpartisan. There's going to be no preference for plans that favor one party or another. And then if we can just generate a whole bunch of random samples from that probability distribution, we'll end up with this big old collection or an ensemble of redistricting plans. Once we have that, then we can go through to each plan and we can say, okay, in this plan, on average, how many seats are the Democrats going to win? How about this plan? How about this plan? And you end up with a distribution over stuff you care about, like the number of Democratic seats. You can look at the distribution over how compact the plans are, or how many people they put in each district, or what the racial composition is. And once you have these distributions over like what you'd expect, basically the range of what you'd expect under a nonpartisan baseline, then you can compare. Okay, here's the plan that the legislature actually passed. Is it lying in the middle of that distribution? Is it about in the range we'd expect what's typical, or is it an outlier? So we're basically doing a hypothesis test where the null hypothesis is like this plan is fair, it's representative of this nonpartisan distribution, and then we're testing that null hypothesis by generating a bunch of samples and comparing and seeing if our actual observed plan is an outlier in any dimension that we care about. Okay. So the big question for researchers then is, okay, well, this is a great plan, but how would I actually go about making this collection of nonpartisan plans? Turns out to be a really tough problem. Even in a state like, I'm going to show you an example of Iowa here. In Iowa, you draw districts based out of counties. There's 99 counties. You put them into 4 districts. Okay, it doesn't sound like that hard a problem. In Iowa, there's like on the order of 10 to the 24. So that's quadrillions of quadrillions, different ways to draw redistricting plans out of contiguous districts. And if you toss the ones that are kind of weirdly shaped or don't have very equal populations, then you can get smaller, but it's a huge number. In New York, there's like over 10,000 precincts and into dozens of districts for Congress or the State House or whatever. So the number of possibilities quickly is bigger than like the number of atoms in the universe. Okay, so you can't just like list all of the options and then like see what the deal is, right? You're going to have to come up with something fancier. So what I've researched is ways to do that. I'm just going to give you like the picture version of an algorithm that we've come up with. The idea is you're going to start with a blank map of your state, in this case Iowa, many, many copies of it. So I'm going to have 5,000 blank maps. And then on each map, you're going to draw one district randomly. And you do this in a particular way where you can actually calculate what's the probability that I ended up drawing this particular district using my procedure. So you can keep track of these probabilities. You're going to go through each of the random districts you generate, and you're going to score them. Okay? Does this one align with the criteria that I need in a redistricting plan? Is it compact? Does it balance the populations correctly? There's other criteria you can put in place about trying to preserve cities, boundaries, and all this kind of stuff. And then, so each of these plans gets a score or a weight, depending on how well it aligns with these criteria. And then you resample, you reshuffle the plans according to these weights, such that plans with like better scores, better redistricting plans are more likely to make it to the next stage. And as you do that, you also draw a random new district. And you keep doing this process of scoring, shuffling, and redrawing until you've filled in the entire map. And it's not obvious from the schematic, but you can actually keep track of the probabilities and weights as you go through this whole thing such that you can actually show, you can prove mathematically that what you're left with at the end of the algorithm is representative of this nonpartisan distribution of plans, this baseline that we're trying to approximate. And that's not something that we could do before. So there were a lot of algorithms that tried to do stuff like this, but they were very sort of ad hoc, and we had no idea what they were really generating. And now we can actually show that this is mathematically representative, and that gives us more confidence that our conclusions are not going to be distorted by weird aspects of the algorithm or any hidden biases that have crept in. Computationally, we can sort of run each of these maps on like a different computer core if you want, so you can really scale it up huge if you want. So you can generate thousands of plans in very big states in a matter of minutes. And so that really allows people to sort of apply this everywhere very practically. And we also had developed a set of diagnostic measures and ways of monitoring this algorithm, so you can make sure that what you're actually getting is what you want and it isn't sort of breaking behind the scenes for you. This is all implemented in some open source software that we've seen people around the country use. Journalists have picked this up, people across academia. So the goal is not just can we come up with an algorithm, but can we also sort of make this accessible to people who want to then apply it to their local city council or whatever. So just to wrap up with a little bit of, so first actually, so here's an example of what you get out of this algorithm when you run it. So this is the state of Ohio and its congressional districts. Not much to see other than that, these look like redistricting plans. They're pretty compact, they're following county boundaries. You just have to take it on faith that in fact these satisfy all the legal criteria that are required of redistricting plans in Ohio. But just to give you an idea of what you can use this for in practice, those plans I showed you actually came from a lawsuit over congressional districts in the state of Ohio that we were hired to consult on as expert witnesses. So we get brought in by the American Civil Liberties Union, and they say, can you do these simulations to show that the plan that the Ohio legislature passed is an outlier? It favors the Republican Party to an extreme amount. And so we generated plans like the one I showed you, and we're able to demonstrate that yes, in fact, the enacted plan was an outlier. And on that basis, the congressional map was struck down in 2021 by the Ohio Supreme Court. So you can use this in litigation, and courts have found it very convincing because, and you can see, you have these example plans right there. It's sort of an intuitive thing, here's what would have happened if parties weren't in control of the process, and here's what actually happened, and let's compare them. But on the academic side, we can do something similar. So we actually did a project where we ran simulations like this in all 50 states for all congressional districts. And we ended up with a collection of sort of 5,000 whole national maps of possible congressional districts. And what lets us do is things like this. So we built this really cool map of every single congressional district in the country, colored by how gerrymandered that particular district is. So if it's really blue, that means that this district ended up more Democratic than it would have otherwise. And if it's really red, then it's more Republican than otherwise. So right now, we're in the New York 10th, and we can see that we did not get gerrymandered very much. Okay, it'd be kind of hard to gerrymander because Manhattan's just so blue. Doesn't really matter how you draw the lines, you're going to end up with a pretty strongly Democratic district. But other places, Texas is really bad, Illinois is really bad. You can see there's a lot of manipulation. So this was a team of grad students, undergrads, pre-docs, faculty, and we did all these simulations, and we were able to sort of do this kind of national analysis using these tools. That's all I have. QR code if you want to read more about this, but I'm happy to answer any questions, and thanks for letting me come and talk to you about my research. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question about the map you were showing.
Yeah.
So some states have, like both colors are present.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
that indicative that like they're essentially packing certain districts in order to create a whole state, or is it sometimes the case that like even a state like Minnesota, which has an independent commission, just like by chance kind of ends up gerrymandering a little bit of both sides?
Yeah, so there's always going to be, some things, so like these states have commissions, Michigan has a commission, Colorado has a commission. So there's, you're always going to see a little bit. There's other ways of testing, specifically at an overall level. And you will see there's always going to be a mix of red and blue, because if you're going to put more Democrats in one district, that's going to put Republicans in another district. So there's always some kind of trade-off. But it doesn't exactly cancel. So like you can look at Utah here. It's all the districts are red. They take Salt Lake City and they divide it up like pizza slices, so that each part of that Democratic city gets spread out into a red, Republican district, and the result is 4 solid, Republican districts. So a lot of different strategies. There's other sort of ways of analyzing this, but we kind of like this sort of district map. It's like a big overview, and then you can dive into other stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
So I know like this has to
Yeah, so I'm actually just, I do work on this, but I actually don't think that we should, at this point, have computers just completely draw the maps. There's just a lot of factors out there that are important that a human has to sort of take into account. One of those is like communities of interest. So it's a very slippery thing, but I mean, we want, for example, if there's like a linguistic minority or like an economic interest, we want them to be in the same districts, that they can like concentrate their voting power and have a representative who's like incentivized to look out for them. But like there's just so many different ways you could define a community of interest. It's very hard for a computer to say, okay, this is an interest that needs to be protected, and here's exactly how it's going to get balanced against these other considerations. So I think it's a really good tool for measurement. It's a really good tool for identifying gerrymanders. There's work being done on sort of coming up with the best plan, but I think there needs to be a human in the loop at the end of the day. So I'm actually happy when we win in court using this technique, but then a human special master gets appointed to draw the maps ultimately, because they can balance those considerations, and they're politically accountable, right? Like there's a person you can go to with your complaints, versus like the algorithm, set me up in this district, and now, this person I don't like is representing me. Yeah. Active area of research. Certainly if you can come up with, for example, like some numerical measure of like here's a precinct, and these should be together this % of the time. Like if you have like for every possible pair of precincts, like a similarity score or something, you can feed that in and we can work with that. Coming up with that, of course, is the huge challenge. So it's like, how do we work on, how do we integrate survey data and demographic data and commute data and all this stuff into like some kind of way of defining these things. It's very hard, but yeah, working on it. Quirky rules. There's some, Ohio's actually a not horrible example. This is not from days of old, but so actually the citizens passed a referendum in 2018 saying, look, we're going to throw out the political process and have a commission, and there's going to be a bunch of rules that constrain the commission. One of those rules was no partisan gerrymandering. That's how we won in court. But the other rules were like these really bonkers things about like county splits. So it's like, if your county has a population between this 100,000 and this 100,000, then it can only be split a certain number of times by a certain number of districts. Actually, we think a lot of those rules were sort of like snuck in there as a way of like disenfranchising voters in the cities. The Republicans actually wrote rules that were designed to just target, Cincinnati or something and mess around with that. But you get some really Baroque stuff. Many states actually don't have any rules at all. Literally, there's not a single place in the state code or constitution that has anything about redistricting. So like anything goes. So yeah, we hope people are better, writing out rules, and there's a lot of progress there too. Like what's a good set of rules for all this? But yeah. We have, okay, one more. Yeah.
You kind of touched on this there, but could you use this to like test the effectiveness of the rules? Like being like, if these rules compress
Yes.
the distribution versus other rules. Like, 'cause I know I've talked to people about this a little bit. Oh, well, you should just basically can't split counties and that'll solve the problem. But obviously it's more complicated, right?
Yeah, in the old days, people would have, like, you could kind of just see a gerrymander because it was very windy and wiggly. These days, people have gotten a lot more sophisticated, and you can have a district that looks totally reasonable, but actually it's gerrymandered. So I think we haven't gotten yet to the point where the research is yet informing reforms, but like we certainly have the tools now to like compare, like here's plans you get under one set of rules, here's the plans you get under another set of rules. How does this change the partisan distribution? How does this change the demographic distribution? All this stuff. So I think hopefully that'll sort of make it back into policy in the future. I'm going to stick around for lunch, so if you want to sort of find me later, happy to chat more. Thanks again.
Hi everyone, nice to meet you. So my name is Vishakh. I'm a PhD student at CDS, where I'm part of the Machine Learning for Language group, and I work with on natural language processing and human-AI collaboration. So what we've been thinking about quite recently is kind of what happens when you put language models in the presence of real users and, examine different effects there. So for the rest of this talk, if I use the word LLM, it refers to like large language models. I'm sure everybody's familiar with this given recent events, but in this particular project, what I'm going to be talking about is, does writing with language models reduce content diversity? And I'll come back to why this might be important at the end of the talk, but we're going to talk about some fairly low-level details first, which is, so our work is kind of inspired by two different directions of research, where some results from social science have actually found that like in the presence of these language models, people's political views can actually be affected and impacted. And additionally, what's happening now is many different users are each using the same model. The canonical example is ChatGPT, where everybody around the world uses the same tool to write emails. And this has the potential to create what's called an algorithmic monoculture, and there's a long line of research here. But specific to our topic, what we're going to ask is, when we collaborate with large language models to write, do we end up writing more similarly to each other, and does this reduce the overall content diversity? So how can we study this tool? So typically, like in my work, we study this by means of user studies, which basically means that the format looks something like this, and I'll walk you through the different steps. So what's happening here is, we want to elicit people's opinions writing with language models. So we collect argumentative essays on open-ended topics, such as this, like, it's very easy for anyone to write about what students should learn at school, and it's also fairly reasonably expected that people have very differing views about this. What we do then is we collect essays on the basis of this prompt from 3 different setups. So the blue line on top is solo writers. It's just people writing without any model help. And then we also collect people writing with 2 different models. So GPT-3 and InstructGPT are kind of OpenAI's, let's say, state-of-the-art API releases that are publicly available to a lot of people to use. So the reason why we differentiate these 2 kinds of models is, on a fairly broad level, InstructGPT is kind of viewed as the better model according to a lot of traditional benchmarks and performance-based metrics, with the reason being that InstructGPT is basically you take GPT-3 and then adapt it on the basis of human feedback. So on a high level, again, what we're basically doing is we're collecting essays that humans write both with and without model help, and we differentiate between the kinds of models, and I'll come to why we do that on a later slide. So what we're going to talk from now is we're going to compare the actual essays that people write with and without model help. And we can maybe come to examples at the end, but yeah. So the first research question is, fundamentally, are people writing more similarly? And I'm going to talk about results, but I'm hopefully going to walk you through this. So our contribution in this paper is, first we formalize what's called a homogenization score. So what you see on the y-axis of this plot is basically homogenization, or the average similarity of a particular essay to what all the other essays that come from the same setup, which basically means that a person writes about what I think kids should be taught at school, how similar is it to all the other essays that are written in the different setups. So in this case, a higher y-axis value basically corresponds to more similar writing. And I feel like one thing that's important here is how do you measure this similarity? In this particular figure, we use this metric called Rouge L. These are all standard metrics, but I want to say that our results are general across many different of these kind of metrics, and these results are kind of in the paper. So first, when you just look at across all of the topics that we collect, across all of the topics, we do find that writing with InstructGPT results in more homogenization or more similar essays, which basically means that the green box plot on the right is more similar when users write with InstructGPT as compared to the other two setups. And because these are a point-wise measure that we've designed, like you can actually take the homogenization scores and do statistical testing, and you can actually see that with statistical significance, people do write more similarly with InstructGPT. And when you dig down further into the details, so we collected essays from many different topics. So one of them was the school that I spoke to you earlier about. We actually have 10 different kinds of topics. And we observed that this effect is fairly general. Across 7 of the 10 topics, the median homogenization of writing with InstructGPT is actually higher than the highest as compared to the other setups. The effect of the homogenization is different slightly based on the topic, and we actually select this wide range of topics to kind of account for that. So for example, if you look at the end, there's stereotypes. In general, people write less similarly about stereotypes because people have very diverse opinions. Whereas like, yeah, some other things like animal welfare and college athletes, people write more similarly on average across all setups. So yeah, the general takeaway being that writing with InstructGPT generally seems to increase this homogenization. But one kind of weird result, which surprised us as well, but maybe in hindsight it makes sense, which is that the other language model that I spoke about, GPT-3, which was the initial language model without human feedback training, actually doesn't have that much of an impact. And that kind of surprised us, which basically kind of tells you that the performance gains that you get when you went from GPT-3 to InstructGPT kind of come at this cost of homogeneity. And I feel like this is something which didn't exist before. And now maybe when you deploy these language models in user-facing situations, we think that this is a sign that you should, it's a different axis on which to evaluate these products. Because do you want people writing more similarly? In some cases, it doesn't matter. Like in emails, who really cares? But like if actually you want to be writing stories or original papers or something, you might care about these metrics. So yeah, our work kind of highlights the difference between the kinds of language models and the impact of the intervention. So this is sort of result one. The second research question is overall diversity, which is a little bit harder to kind of measure because what does it even mean to measure diversity? And like very broadly, diversity typically refers to the fraction of unique information in like a particular set of essays. And this is not super well defined. So we make one claim, which is that you can compare the content of the essays using summarization. So what do I mean is, let's say this is an example essay, right? Like this is something about like screen time, and people have written about like, I don't know, I think this person wrote about teenagers, it not being an issue with just teenagers. And what we can do is, we can take this essay, which is at the raw text level, and we can summarize it into atomic key points, which basically means that I can feed the individual essay in, and I can extract atomic key points of the content of that particular essay. And what I can now do is, if I frame this individual key point as a unit of content, I can use this to formalize diversity. And specifically, the key points that you see on the bottom, what we contend is that you can measure diversity as the fraction of unique key points across all of the essays. And this is through any traditional like clustering technique, which are like super well studied. So an example to maybe make this clear is, let's say you have 2 different essays and you have a bunch of key points that come from them. The particular specifics, I mean, I'll leave you to read that if you want. But the idea is that when you do clustering, what you do is you find similar key points. So you might look at these 2 key points across 2 different essays, and you find that they're reasonably similar, so you can maybe cluster them together. And in this process, you can find many separate clusters of key points and measure the diversity as the fraction. So basically, out of the 6 key points on your screen, maybe you actually only have 4 unique key points. So this gives you a principal measure of this diversity. And what happens? Like, what do we actually find with this diversity measure? Again, boring results table, but so one caveat here is when you do clustering, there's actually a hyperparameter in the algorithm which says how similar should an element be for it to be clustered. And we actually vary that a lot. And we also have results for different measures of clustering. But it seems quite clear that across all of the thresholds and even across all of the similarity measures that we look at, again, writing with InstructGPT reduces this content diversity than the other two setups. And I feel like this is one thing which is a little bit more important than earlier measures. So previous works that look at like diversity, they talk about like word levels, words, phrases. And I'm sure we've seen this, right? Like ChatGPT tells us these similar phrases. But the impact of reduced content diversity is perhaps a little more like broad, and there are even like some social considerations. And like English teachers have come back to us with some of the concerns of like these kinds of findings. And I think, yeah, it's fairly like broad that you can go from here. But yeah, I'll leave you with just some takeaways, and hopefully we do have time for questions, which is the two takeaways from our work is it does seem that collaborating with InstructGPT results in people writing more similar essays with reduced diversity as a whole. And we do observe that this effect is not as much with the traditional GPT-3. And this kind of maybe tells you that the feedback tuning that we're doing, and actually like there's a whole science on like how to best use the human feedback. It kind of tells you that this performance bump using human feedback comes at a cost. And yeah, I guess that's my time. And yeah, please reach out to me if there's any time for questions. Cool. So typically, so when you say prompt engineering, what you basically change is what is provided to the language model in order to elicit different results, right? And in our case, as the people are writing, they're writing fundamentally different essays as it is, right? So in a way, our users do the prompt engineering by like providing slightly different context on the basis of that. We did experiment with like, if you explicitly say, don't write similar things, or like, the traditional simple tricks of prompt engineering don't solve this issue. And actually, like, when you look at the output distribution of InstructGPT, it's actually more narrow itself. So it's definitely like something principled arising from the additional feedback tuning. I don't want to make the claim that there exists no prompt engineering solution, but I think the concern is how scalable is that? Like, how much prompt engineering are you going to do? And like, you don't know for your different use cases what's the best prompt. And like, I feel like this is something especially the user doesn't want to bother with. So you as the provider might have to do it. I don't know the economics of this, but I guess that's sense.
My question was going to be about, you kind of had identified the different topics, the 7 that
Yeah.
the kind of the same.
Yeah.
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 Do you have any hypotheses for like why these separate, like why these 7 actions? Just because where they work out, or is it going to be thought about how to dive into that?
So yeah, one actually way that you can think a little bit about this is what are the different views on the internet about these particular topics. And there are like works that like scrape, so there are open source like pre-training data sets, and people scrape these data sets for how frequently, like, let's say college athletes are measured online. And let's say there's like a wide consensus on what people think about college athletes online. That's going to be reflected more on the language model, and like that has the potential. But making the causal claim is quite hard. You could do like a correlation analysis of like frequency of these topics in pre-training. That's the way you would go forward with that. I think there was one more in the back. Yeah. That's actually a very, very important question. And actually, like, the self-feeding loops is another issue, right? Because let's say, like, I share exactly your concern, where I use ChatGPT to write emails, and it just suggests, like, I mean, for want of a better word, like Western internet information, right? And so now you kind of, like, marginalized groups are writing more similar to the, let's say, the mode of the content. So you actually lose diversity of information on the internet. So it's a very big concern, and people have been, but it's very hard to measure this because, like, the measure that we presented for diversity, it's not actually that scalable. In this case, for 100 essays, it's still very expensive. I can't even imagine doing this for the internet. So, but the feedback loop is a big concern, and actually there is some, like, very recent work talking about this, and yeah, I don't have a solution. I think this is a problem, and yeah, we'll see where we go. Yeah. We're good? Okay, cool. Sure. Sounds good. Yeah. Reach out to me. Yeah, I'll probably be downstairs. Yeah, of course. Also, yeah, email me. My name is, my first name at nyu.edu. Sure. We'll see something. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, just. All right, good morning. Welcome. It is still morning. It is still morning for another 10 minutes. Welcome back. So my name, as some of you know, is Pascal, and I'm a professor here in the Center for Data Science. And today I will tell you about, there you go, our research on, Well, so today I'll tell you about what we do in our lab, which is we study music from a data science perspective. So the question is, what happens if you put a piece of music under the microscope of science and do some data science with it? Now, a student recently challenged me on this. They were like, Pascal, why are you doing this? What is the point of doing this? Because we have talked about the 800-pound gorilla in the room. That gorilla is green because it's Spotify. So what they were like is like, okay, why are you doing this if Spotify exists? And they do have a good point, which is Spotify has big data. I teach a big data class in the spring, so big data is usually better. Better data. Big data is better big data usually. So, but to address this point, to address the 800-point gorilla in the room, I do want to contrast point by point what the point of doing this in academia versus industry is. The first one is, it is true that they do have a lot of users, 450 million plus. This has grown. This grows every day. So this is not even a slide I can update in real time because I should link it up to something. But basically, last time I talked to one of the data scientists, they had about 500 million users. We have like 1,000 users, like research participants. And their catalog is between 80 million and 100 million songs. Ours is 1,000 songs. And they have a lot of computational resources. Ours are like comparatively modest. So at this point, it's not looking good, right? Maybe I should do something else in my life while I'm still relatively young, yes? But then things change a little bit because if you look at, how this data is recorded, obviously in Spotify, this happens while people do other things. So they just listen to songs, and we have no reliable information for most people of what they like. Whereas in our case, we do this in our lab, so it's a research setting, so there is no data systematically missing. So they have a massive coverage problem. I recently, like I said, talked to one of the data scientists. In theory, they have 100 million songs. The modal value of plays for these 100 million songs is 0. The next most common play count is 1. So in other words, something like 1,000 songs make up for 99.9% or something like that of their plays. Whereas we basically sidestep this problem because we very carefully, this took a year, picked those 1,000 songs that we do use from basically all songs to cover that space carefully. I'll explain that later. We obviously have experimental control and they don't. So we're literally doing this in a lab with headphones and no other distractions, whereas people use whatever hardware they have to play songs, maybe on the train or whatever. And again, they have self-selection effects. We don't. We pick the playlist and we pick it at random, and the order too. This has all kinds of important effects that we'll talk about in a moment. And so obviously they can't really do causal inference, really, because those of you who took the causal inference class know if it's based on observations only, that is devilishly hard, yes? Whereas, you know, if it's based on an experiment like we do, it's relatively easy, LOL, right? Like we literally control all the factors. And they don't really know anything else about the user other than some group level characteristics. Maybe you log in from a certain zip code, whereas we have all kinds of covariates, and we'll talk about that in a moment. There is, however, an important caveat, which they do well, I guess, which is that they're playing full songs, and because we're doing an experiment, frankly, to cover the space of songs in one experimental session, you have to use small excerpts, yes, like 5-second clips from the song. And when we got into this, I was very surprised to learn that this had not been addressed in the literature for like 100 years. For 100 years, people have been using little musical clips to represent the whole song, but nobody had actually checked if the response to a song is psychologically representative of the whole song. Rating, familiarity, things like that, emotions evoked. And people just assumed that, I guess. So if you look in the method section of all these music papers, they're like, well, we just use these clips, full stop. That's it. So we looked at that. And it is a valid concern because you could think that, for instance, this is one song this is the audiogram. Like if you look at the how loud it is over time, that varies. This is just one random picked song. The spectrogram changes, so basically which frequencies are present at which time. And if you extract the auditory features, I don't know, is anyone here who uses Librosa? No? Some people are. So you can extract features like brightness or sensory dissonance from that. And so it is reasonable to think that people would respond to different sections of the song differently, yes? That's not unreasonable, given that the song changes so much, right? So we checked this in the lab. We played one song. So we picked 3 clips from the intro, 15, 10, and 5 seconds clips from the chorus, from the verse, and then from some section that a panel of experts thought was representative. Like if you think of that song, that's the part that you think of, okay? So to make a long story short, because I want to get to other stuff, I'm timed here, right, Remy? I'm on the clock. I want to cut straight to the chase. Yes, yeah. The answer is yes. You can use small clips, small excerpts, to represent psychologically the entire song, which is quite shocking. So, and look at that. There's a new projector. The bars are visible. Can you see them? Wonderful. So basically, the median correlation between the rating of the excerpt and the rating of the song is strong. It's very high, yes? Look at that. When do you see such a median correlation in the wild ever? So very, very excited about that. And I don't want to belabor the point of this. It doesn't really matter which, how long you make this. At 5 seconds, that's actually already saturated. So what we're doing now, currently, right now in the lab, is to see how low can you go? 1 second? Like at what point does this correlation disappear? A couple of bars? We don't know yet. But at 5 seconds, this is already saturated. Whatever people can make up their mind about how they like or dislike a song within 5 seconds. The second thing is, the exception of the intro and the outro, which are often different from the rest of the song, doesn't matter. Chorus, verse, representative song, it's the same. And so to make a long story short, again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because we just published this. Some of the authors here are students here. For instance, Spivak. Spivak is a current master's student in the program. So we're doing this with, well, no, I don't think anyone is here right now, but with some of you, like it's in-house expertise. Yes, I'm very excited about that. All right, but now that we established this, and I'm very excited about this because for over 100 years this question was open, we can now look at what you can do with that. So now we can do dense sampling, that is like an individual research participant comes into our lab, and we can expose them to hundreds of excerpts in one session, yes? So we don't have the missing data problem or the self-selection problem. We have a full matrix of hundreds of ratings for hundreds of very diverse songs from a very diverse crowd of people. So one thing you can see here is that some songs are very well-liked. So for instance, Rolling in the Deep, you see that this is 7 means I love this song. 6 means I like it a lot, yes. 1 means I hate this song. 2 means I dislike it, but I don't hate it, and so on. So you can see here, these are our most poker face, look at that. These are our most liked songs. Two things to see here. First of all, they're not usually normally distributed, which is actually a feature, because now that we know that almost everybody likes this song, we can now use this experimentally, which is also, you might be surprised to learn, has not been studied systematically, like how a positive song can move someone's mood, because we can take songs that everybody will like. If you look at the existing literature, they say we used happy songs or sad songs. They're like, how do you know these are happy songs? What are you talking about? So now we can do that. The second thing we can do, and this is, I'm even more excited about that, is as you can see, usually there's no normal distribution. So some songs here, for instance, look at that blank space, look at this, are basically uniformly distributed. So now, if you like this song or dislike this song, that tells us a lot about you, yes? So it's actually very interesting. Normal distributions are rare. They're usually exponential, or so power laws distributions, or uniform. So the power laws we're going to use to, push the participant, and the more uniform ones we use to characterize people. All right. So briefly, so let's tell you how. Let me tell you how we do this. I already just said we have these additional features that Spotify doesn't have. So for instance, we ask people which emotions are evoked by a given song. And so what you can see here is that each song, I'm not sure if you can read this, has a very particular signature between, like, in addition to appraisal, which is like the golden slice, and familiarity, which is the blue slice, and energetic arousal, which is the pink slice. It's like joy, groove, awe, nostalgia, reflection, nothing, boredom, sadness, anxiety, disgust, and anger. By the way, we had a lot of discussion in the lab about this before we did this. Can music make you angry? And it can. But if you look at here, so Rockstar, I don't know, some other songs, they have a very happy, look at that. Happy does make some people happy, look at that, joy. But other people, these are other people, makes them angry and disgusted. So the idea now is we can use these songs to characterize individuals. And every song has a very particular fingerprint. So for instance, if you look here at the Star Wars theme, look at that, pretty awesome. But I think we'd all agree that it is not groovy, like this slice is missing. Or like this 20th Century Fox fanfare, great, very familiar, lots of nostalgia. Look at the nostalgia, just max here, but not groovy. So these fingerprints are very characteristic, yes? But now we can use these emotions to see if we can predict ratings from that, right? So we actually directly contrast the Spotify API audio features. They give you 9 audio features: danceability, energy, valence, right? And we cross-correlated them. I mean, obviously, you can see this is correlated. For instance, danceability and energy is highly correlated. That's not surprising. These are not necessarily independent features. With our 11 emotions. And to make a long story short, in the interest of time, the model you can build from the audio features only. So the model that Spotify could build, predicting your rating from the audio features only, is okay. R squared of 0.16 is not bad, not terrible. Isn't there like a Chernobyl reference? Not great, but not terrible. Yeah, 4.2 Röntgen. Yes. 3.6. I apologize. You're a good man. Okay. Anyway, so yes, not great, not terrible. All right. But can we do better? The answer is yes. This is our model based on the emotion response only. So basically yes. If I know what emotions are evoked by the song, I can predict how much you will like it. Brief aside, sad is not bad in music. Some people, for a reason that I don't understand, like sad music, at least sometimes. All right, if a student showed me this, I would be like, there's no way. You're overfitting, but we checked. We're not overfitting, so this is real. So what it seems to be the case is, and this is pretty shocking, that the audio features are too far away from the rating, yes? It goes through emotional responses that are evoked, but why? We strongly believe there's an interplay between personality, is our X factor, but also the associations you have with the song. We'll get to that in a moment. We're currently studying this right now. But basically, what Spotify has is too far, and Librosa is too far. The audio features are not unimportant, obviously, but they seem to be just like something you hit the system with to get get the emotions out. And once you get the emotions out, you are very close to the rating. Why do different people get different emotions from the same audio feature? The answer is their associations are different, and who knows their personality probably. We'll talk about it in a moment. All right, something else I'm very excited about is what the lab allows you to do is disaggregation. Let me give you an example. So on the top here is the aggregated response. We asked 500 people in the lab to move a slider, like in those appraisal polling when someone is doing a political debate. How much do you like the song right now? Okay, moment to moment. And what this, by the way, Smells Like Teen Spirit by Nirvana. Yes, that's this song in particular. And what almost often looked like is, oh, there's an immediate, like some ramp, and then it's just kind of noise, which is very weird in a way, yes? And maybe the basis for the fact that it doesn't really matter where you pick it from. However, if you look into so this is the average response, the aggregate response of the entire group. If you dig deeper into this, you can find 4 distinct response styles. One we call jumpers. Within seconds, they make up their mind, and they just jump to whatever final level they jump to within seconds, and they don't move the slider anymore after that. It's amazing. Other people, we call them drifters. It seems like a drift diffusion model. They seem to be responding to every feature in the song as it comes on. It's quite striking. So it's like almost like Brownian motion with some push. I mean, we can model them. We are modeling them like that. But there's sitters, unclear what they're doing. Maybe this song doesn't move them, or maybe they don't do the task, or maybe that's just their response style. They just don't do much. And then we call them gymnasts, somewhat flippantly. Yes, 1 minute. They move a lot, but they don't really go anywhere. It's just all over the place. Who knows? A lot of motion, but no direction. Finally, and I see people lining up. Oh no. Just briefly, this is not just this one song. So what you could say, well, maybe people recognize this song. They remember that they like it or dislike it. That's why they're jumpers. That is not true. If you're a jumper or a drifter, you're that across the songs, across different songs. It seems to be like a personal response style. And we have all kinds of features to look at that. For instance, how many interactions, the total L1 distance, the final distance, and the response interval. One moment. And then if you look at that, you can. That's interesting. Interesting color rendering, but it is accurate. So basically, this is the final distance normalized in standard deviations, and the interactions normalized in standard deviation space. And so now we can link this to personality. And what we found already is that these drifters seem to be more an explore-exploit trade-off. The explore-exploit trade-off, openness to experience, is basically a personality characteristic that psychologists are aware of. And it is the case that we can measure this basically as beyond surveys. So these personality measures, explore-exploit, openness to new experience, it's like a survey response. Like, I am an open-minded person. Well, we could link this. I don't have a slide for this yet, but we can link this to these personality characteristics, and we're very excited about that. So it's now a behavioral manifestation, to our knowledge, the first stable, reliable one. Okay, in the interest of time, because we're out of time, I'm going to skip our psychopath diagnostics that we can also do. But basically, psychopaths and non-psychopaths like different songs. Why? Because psychopaths have a different emotional processing. If you want to know more about that, I'll tell you afterwards. But basically, the next step is now validating this. So we are right now, we order some Garmin watches where people wear like wearables, where we do heart rate on a second-to-second basis. Some of you order those things for us. So we do physiological measures. We do want to know these associations. We're doing this right now. We're asking people, like, what do you associate with this song? And we have some meme songs where we know that the response doesn't come from the song, but from the association. It's hilarious, actually. If you want to talk about it later, if you think of some meme songs, we'll always look for more. The one we're using right now is CBAT. Does anyone know about CBAT? It's pretty funny if you know about it. If not, it has no impact. That's just one of them we use. As I said, we can use this to induce mood experimentally. And finally, this is not as, alternative as I said it is. We can link those. It's not mutually exclusive. Okay, final slide. That's our lab versus the gorilla. Okay, question. By the way, importantly, not Q&A. I might not have any answers for you, but Q&R. Your question, my response. All right. So there's the gentleman. Yes. It's a great question. Here's the problem. I bet there is. But if you're interested in that, call us. Or No, what I mean by that is, or email me. What I mean by that is we literally don't have the bandwidth to, the data set is extremely rich. I think I'm just going to open source it soon once we have one or more two publications out of it. But there's so many things that we haven't even looked at. But for instance, the lyrics absolutely will probably, like why is someone disgusted with some songs? 100% probably the lyrics, yes. Kirtana.
What about research in relation to
Yes, interesting. So at first we thought it's just that. It's just like, you just recognize this from your associations. But here's the thing, even if you have not listened to a particular song, there's going to be associations with the genre or overall style. So that, surprisingly to us, made very little difference. We looked at. I was like, oh, this is just, recognition. But associations transcend that. But there's a lot to say about that too. Yes?
You talked about how a lot of songs have kind of a one-side distribution.
Mm-hmm.
You have a normal. Are there any that have like an inverse, like what you might call
Bimodal, yes. Actually, Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit, was one of our few. There's like 5 to 10 songs we found that have a bimodal distribution. Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit was one of them, yes. That's why I used that in the example, yes. And that's actually amazing. So now you can use that for personality characterization because something like the MBTI or something like that would work if you had a bimodal item distribution, but you don't. We do. So this is very exciting. Anyone else? Oh, we good? Okay. Anyway, I will linger longer and kind of lurk in the back, and so you can talk to me afterwards if you want. All right, sure.
Hello, I'm Falaah. I'm a third-year PhD student at CDS. I work with Julia Stoyanovich, and I'm going to present a paper titled Towards Substantive Conceptions of Algorithmic Fairness, Normative Guidance from Equal Opportunity Doctrines. We will unpack that over the course of the talk. So here's the motivation. Algorithmic fairness and algorithmic safety have become like a talking point in the news as well, but the problem with algorithmic fairness is that fairness is a philosophical concept, not a mathematical or a formal one, and so there are multiple definitions. There's no single definition that will be applicable in all contexts. The second problem really is that we now have way too many metrics because we're a very excited community that loves defining disparity metrics, but we don't have enough guidance about which metric to use in which context and what these metrics actually say. The third problem really is that the moment we have mathematical metrics, we have trade-offs, and so what we're seeing now is that multiple metrics are not simultaneously satisfiable. And so what do you do practically when you can't have everything that you want? So here's one of the famous impossibilities. This was work done by investigative journalists, not academics, from ProPublica, that looked at this tool called Compass that was used to decide sentences for defendants who have been accused of violent crimes. And so what they saw was two concerning things. Firstly, it's the fact that the tool has a higher false positive rate for black defendants. This means that it systematically over-predicts their risk of recidivating even when they actually don't go on to do it. On top of that, it also has a higher false negative rate for white defendants, which means it systematically goes on to under-predict their risk even when they go on to recidivate. This is a double-sided problem. And so what ended up happening is this really set into motion the community called fair machine learning, but that was pushed back by the designers of this tool. So what the designers of this tool asserted was that the tool satisfied calibration assessment, which is within groups, outcomes were calibrated. So now there really was this tension in the community about we can't simultaneously satisfy both, and so this was a couple of papers that came out, and this is very simply just from the confusion matrix of any model. You can see that you can't simultaneously satisfy false positive rates, false negative rates, and accuracy and calibration if you don't have base rates. We'll unpack this more. But the point really is that these impossibilities are fundamental. We're not going to get over them. And so maybe the point is not to debate in math, but to debate in philosophy. So the idea is, instead of being metric first and trying to sort of satisfy many, many metrics, why can't we be doctrine first? And the intuition is as follows. Mathematically incompatible measures actually encode different moral judgments. And so we don't want to, in practice, simultaneously satisfy them. We don't desire them simultaneously. And so in order to do this, we need to move beyond just computer science. And so what we did in this work was to go read a ton of philosophy and to look at this one notion of philosophy called equal opportunity and see what those doctrines tell us, and see if there's sort of a mapping between a metric and a doctrine, because the doctrines come with a mapping to a context. So for example, some doctrines only apply to certain contexts, and so then we can actually contextualize fairness. So let's jump into it. Jumping right in, what is equal opportunity? Equal opportunity is a doctrine from political philosophy that objects to any morally irrelevant factor affecting your access to desirable positions. So here we invoke Marie Kondo, sort of telling you to throw out anything that's morally irrelevant, such as gender, race, disability, and so on. What I'll tell you now was sort of missing from the computer science understanding of equal opportunity, and these are ideas from philosophy. So the first thing we do is we sort of arrange different doctrines based on different principles in order to understand which one to apply where. And so there are two principles. The first principle is the principle of fair contests or non-discrimination, which simply says if there are any barriers to access, break them. So barriers such as national origin, socioeconomic status should not affect people's opportunity to run the contest. The second principle sort of takes a broader view. So equal opportunity is not about a single contest, but about opportunities over the course of a lifetime. So not just about breaking those walls, but also look at the terrain that people have been running on. So that's really the principle of fair life chances. The second sort of structure that we'll build here in order to do this analysis is the notion of domains of EO. So the first domain, which is what fair machine learning looks at a lot, is fairness at a specific decision point. So we look at like a contest, for example, hiring, or let's say college admissions, as a single contest. Do you get admitted or do you not get admitted? This is usually the view. But equal opportunity asks you to look broader. It asks you to look at equality and developmental opportunities. We're all running the race, but how much access to training did each of us have? How much access to qualifications, building opportunities did we have? And are those bundles comparable? This is something that's not really looked at in the literature. The third focus is really opportunities over the course of a lifetime. And the intuition here is that when you win one contest, it sort of like fast tracks you to win later contests. And when you lose one contest, you lose access to opportunities to get better. And so it's not just enough to look at a single view, you actually have to look at opportunity sets over the course of a lifetime. Okay, so using these to sort of re-look at that impossibility result, we'll walk through two doctrines and then see what they tell us. So the prior work in this area really just had that narrow focus of like a single contest. And so what prior work did was to map different measures onto different doctrines, but only as criteria on single decision points, as if we're just running one contest all of our lives. And so we'll go into why these are wrong, and you'll have to trust me that we refuted a bunch of their claims because we have only 10 minutes. But the idea really is that we're missing something broader that philosophy is telling us here. So let's jump into it. I will cover the first two. So I gave you two principles: fair contests as single decision points, and then fair life chances over the course of a lifetime. We'll cover the first in this talk, but the other two we go into in the paper as well. So let's unpack formal and formal plus EO. So formal EO comes from this very influential doctrine from Bernard Williams that imagines a warrior society. The setup is as follows. Equal opportunity is satisfied in a society where anybody can compete to be a warrior, not just children of warrior parents. And this really goes back to like the French Revolution, where positions were distributed on the basis of like birth and basis of nobility. And so even the fact that you could say, do away with morally irrelevant factors at that time was like moral progress. Now this is clearly not enough, right? And so, the judgment really is that people should only be judged on the basis of relevant qualifications, and all outcomes should be delivered to people who have merit. So let's look at what we map this to. A common view in fair machine learning is fairness through blindness, where you just remove covariates that are irrelevant. So you just remove gender, race, disability, all of those factors, and then fit a model. But already maybe we could start thinking about how there are proxies in the data set. So even if you remove race, but you keep in something like zip code, there's a proxy that's learned through it, right? And so fairness through blindness really is a very weak, and like it's well appreciated that this is too weak for us to use. So I will omit it for now. The second mapping that we do is to map formal EO as a metric on calibration. So this is the metric of calibration, which says, for the same predicted score, S is equal to C, if people differ only on the basis of their group membership, which is now based on a morally irrelevant factor like gender, race, disability, then they should get the same outcome. This is exactly what formal EO is telling us. If the thing that's morally irrelevant is the only thing that's differing, which is A, and the thing that's morally relevant, which is the score, is the same, people should get the same outcome. So calibration across groups satisfies or encodes formal EO's moral desiderata. Okay, moving on. So let's think about why formal EO is not enough. What formal EO says is that the contest that we set up or the test that we use to measure merit, that is what we based outcomes on. But what if the test itself is systematically skewed based on privilege? So think about the SAT. Yes, the SAT does capture some notion of like intelligence or IQ or performance, but it also captures people's preparedness, people's access to preparatory materials, the number of times they write these tests, right? And so we have another doctrine called Formal Plus from Fishkin, which says that if the validity of a score varies across groups, then that does not satisfy Formal Plus EO. And so the SAT is like a canonical example. Let's think about what this would map to. This immediately maps to error rate balance across groups. We're saying we don't want a test that systematically overpredicts or underpredicts anybody's qualifications. The first criterion is a false positive and the second is false negative. So Formal Plus EO just really comes down to an error rate balance across groups. Okay, let's put this together. So I'm going to keep this statement up for a second. So this was the impossibility result. That said, absent of a perfect classifier, it's impossible to simultaneously satisfy calibration and error rate balance if base rates are different. So we'll break this down one by one. So we just saw that the calibration within groups criteria maps to formal EO. Let's see what this tells us. So S is equal to C is a predicted score based on past performance. If you think of equal opportunity as a way to sort of regulate your qualifications and the access to opportunities that build those qualifications, this is an endpoint view. We're conditioning on the predicted score. You have already built up your qualifications. Given your current qualifications, you should get a fair outcome. So this is an endpoint, backward-facing view of equal opportunity. Let's look at what Formal Plus does. Formal Plus instead conditions on the label, not on the predicted score. So let's think about what the label represents. In the context of like hiring or like admissions, the label represents your likelihood of succeeding in the position on offer, not your likelihood of succeeding in the past. So this is a forward-facing starting point view. If you think about what Fishkin was talking about, we want to accurately estimate people's future likelihood of being good warriors, or likelihood of actually doing well in the future. So this is just a starting point, forward-facing view. The third component of this framework is the base rates, or the prevalence, which was in the statement of the impossibility results. So mathematically, the prevalence is just the incidence of the label. So it's just P of Y is equal to 1. So in the context of, let's say, hiring, that's just the fraction of people who get a positive outcome. So life chances is a broad philosophical concept, but you have to also remember the impossibility result applies to one single classifier, right? So if you collapse down life chances into a single metric, what you get actually is prevalence. So think about it this way. In a society where men and women had, let's say, equal opportunity to, let's say, education in CS theory, the proportion of men and the proportion of women would be the same. So like in the real world, prevalence sort of captures your life chances. Okay, putting all of this together now. I'm trying really not to go over time. Okay, putting all of this together, let's look back at the statement. The statement said we cannot simultaneously satisfy calibration across groups, which is a backward-facing view, and error rate balance, which is a forward-facing view, when people don't have comparable base rates. So what this really tells you is you can't accurately estimate past qualifications and future performance if life chances are not equal. And one thing that we have to remember is the base rates is not something we control. We can control calibration, we can control error rates, but the base rate is something the universe gives us. How many people actually get the positive outcome, right? And so two takeaways from this really is that now we can debate in norms. Now we can start with, is our contest forward-facing, backward-facing, and what do we need? But also, we sort of need to move away from single contest views and actually do substantive EO, actually improve people's base rates. So the last idea I would sort of leave you with. So, okay, so two takeaways. One is if you come back and look at Compass and look at what Compass was saying, the thing that we're trying to predict in Compass is recidivism, which is reoffense in the future. This is a forward-looking, like the label itself is forward-looking. So it's no longer enough to look at something like calibration across groups for a context like compass. And this is important because if we have to audit models holistically, we need to know what metric we're going to use. The second takeaway really is that let's think about why substantive EO is important. First, we said anybody who wants to be a warrior should be allowed to compete. Then we also said that what if warrior children can use their privilege to do better than non-warrior children, right? And so the problem is not solely with the test that overestimates their performance. The problem really is that warrior children will actually go on to be good warriors. So substantive EO is a lot more than sort of controlling for past outcomes, but actually improving equity in the future. And this is not something we've done at all in the landscape so far. And so the second half of the paper sort of motivates how do we do this? How do we build mechanisms that are cognizant of the future and the past, and also sort of like apply these parity constraints? I'm going to stop there. I can take questions, and I will just point you to 2 resources. Yeah, so we actually we were making a comic book about fairness first, and then we realized we had more work to do. So for an accessible version of everything I've said, you can read the comic. But for an updated view about the use of these in like auditing, you should read the paper. But those are my collaborators, and thank you for your attention. Any questions? Yeah? Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so SATs is the perfect example. So I skipped the substantive conceptions. One conception is called luck egalitarian EO, which says it's not fair to compare people's effort overall. You have to compare people's effort within their distribution, because their qualifications are not a function of them, but a function of their group. And so what we're showing here is that you compare like the best within groups, the best amongst white men, black women, and so on. And so this is really what affirmative action type policies do, but then we also have a tension about whether they're effective or not, right? And there's a second line of work that talks about like, it's called the delayed impact of fair machine learning, where you might actually see unfairness for the first 2, let's say, years, but then in the long term, you see fairness, right? And so these kind of arguments, like you mentioned, really need to be made long term, because what do you do in one cycle? Any other questions? Okay, I think we're on time anyway. Thank you.